Hi, Beth. Thanks for joining
Hi.
today. Can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, so I'm Dr Beth Mosley and I'm a lead clinical psychologist and I work for NSFT.
Thank you. I've got a number of questions to ask you, four precisely, and I'll start with the first one. The first one is, how are you looking after yourself and how are you supporting your team?
Okay, well, I think this period of time that we've now been in lockdown is extended to 3 months plus. And so perhaps some of the things I did at the beginning are different from the things I'm doing now as this has become a more established way of life, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think as we went into lockdown and my team who work in schools, I have a team of psychologists who work in schools, they very quickly had to stop working in those schools and finish up the pieces of work that they were doing. And then as a team, we were redeployed into another service. So there was a lot of adjustment and change for us from a working point of view, as there have been for many people. And of course, like everyone else, a huge amount of uncertainty about what that was going to look like in this new way of working. Whilst at the same time losing all the ways that we would normally support one another. So typically we would see each other, we'd see other work colleagues. And I think this is true for us on a personal level too, that one of the big challenges of the lockdown is that the things that we've relied on to help us cope with the stresses and strains of our life, we've not necessarily been able to turn to in the same way that we would have done before COVID, because we've all been very restricted in what we can actually do. And so for me, looking after myself was a key priority, because if I wasn't able to do that, then I wouldn't be able to support my team and be a good leader. And I guess good leadership is about having some sense of a direction of where you're going, which is really challenging when all of a sudden the directions disappeared, the roadmaps being thrown out the window, and also kind of having a bit of a strategic oversight of where you're heading, and some degree of certainty to give your team a sense of confidence, really, that you have an appreciation of where you're going and the way you're going to do that. But at the same time, it's important to be acknowledging the level of uncertainty and the feelings that this situation brings, so that you're connecting with everybody else's experience, really, of feeling a really big mix and range of feelings. For me personally, a crisis is something that I have got quite good ways of responding to, whereas for other people that isn't the case. And so I think as a leader, I really had to appreciate that the challenges I was facing as a leader around adapting and change and uncertainty were perhaps not raising the same levels of anxiety as they might have done for those members of my team. And I had to kind of hold that in mind, so that my bulldozing ahead to move forward to the new ideas and the new ways of working were in step with how my team were feeling, and so that I wasn't kind of taking that for granted and sort of dragging them along when they might be feeling quite different from me. Now that's difficult when you're doing it within a virtual space and you're not used to doing that, because we lose so many of those small ways of communicating non-verbally, or those small conversations we might have with people on the way into a meeting or out of a meeting. So I guess in a way it required a kind of more open, transparent way of talking about these things and naming the feelings that I'm experiencing as a leader in a containing way, so it doesn't feel completely off the wall, but giving other people the same opportunity to talk about the difficult things, and to use things like humour. It's so helpful if we can recognise that this is really difficult, but humour can sometimes help us through. And actually, those moments in our team meetings where things would descend to a bit of chaos and we could all be laughing were some of the really helpful points where we would be able to connect with kind of the rawness of being human beings and really struggling with this, not just as professionals, but as people. with our own kind of family difficulties and fears and anxieties about what this might mean for us as individuals as well as our loved ones.
Wow, some words repeated that are really important about people, leadership, uncertainty, anxiety, humour, communication. Thank you. That's a really in-depth description of what you've been doing, and just what I would expect from you as well. So that's great. Thank you, Beth. The second question is, how has the pandemic impacted on your work? If you'd like to describe some of that as well, please, and the people you support.
So yes, as I mentioned, we work in schools, and our work is very much about embedding ourselves in the community we work in. But as it was considered non-essential and we got pulled into supporting more crisis work, we weren't able to continue that. But I think one of the important things really about this is kind of opportunities for hope and feeling like you can make a difference. I remember at the beginning of this pandemic having lots of WhatsApp conversations with friends and getting quite heated about, oh, the government making the right decision, what's happening here, what's happening there. And I had a friend who gave me some really good advice, and he said, let's concentrate on what we can influence. And I stepped away from that and I thought, you know what, that's so true. And I'm so fortunate in my job and in my position that I do have opportunities, and my team have opportunities to make a difference and influence things. And so I really concentrated all that energy I was spending on worrying about what this means and what this is going to bring, to thinking about how can we be helpful during this time. So obviously as a team we were working together in a new service and we were offering help to that other service. But what I felt would be helpful is that we should, as a team, still continue to hold in mind the needs of the communities we've been working in, because there was a real sense of betrayal in a way, that in the crisis we were stepping away from the people that we have become so closely connected to and who trust us and rely on us at the time that they probably need it the most. So what we tried to do is stay connected to those communities and provide them with some helpful information and support packs that would meet their needs as they're facing the challenges of returning to school. So throughout our other work, we were able to do that. And actually for the team, I think that was really important because it enabled them to feel like they were still connected to their communities and were able to do a creative task. So I think what that taught us really is that you can adopt and work in new different ways and still be supportive to the community that you've been working in, even if you're not in the exact same physical space. And I think we're all learning that at the moment. And when we think about moving forward and how we now, as we step back into our work with the schools, how this is going to change the work we do, again, we can think about challenges. You know, a lot of the media language is about the tsunami of mental health difficulties. And, you know, there's a lot of negative language in the press about what the future holds. And I think if we get caught up with that, we can feel frightened about the future, frightened as health professionals about how are we going to cope? We were barely managing before. But I think what this experience has taught my team is that within this space, there are opportunities for new ways of being. So, for example, one of the things we started to do on the request of schools and parents was start doing some podcasts for parents about the common themes they're struggling with at the moment. And that's been so warmly received because we're in a unique position where we're not just talking about ourselves as professionals with our professional hat on, but we're actually in not the same boat, but we're in the same sea as everyone else. We're having to negotiate many of these challenges that other people are having to manage. And so we're able to talk not just as professionals about sleep and looking after our kids and responding to those challenges, we're able to talk about as parents as well, facing the same unusual situation. And I think that's been really, really helpful for those people who maybe feel sometimes we take too much of an expert position and tell people what to do. So it's allowed a new dialogue. And I think about that going back into the schools, we have a different opportunity here, because rather than people making the assumption that this work only applies to some young people or to some adults, actually everybody is acknowledging the impact of this unusual time and the losses that have occurred and the anxieties that have been raised. They're relating it to themselves as individuals and their family members, and they're recognizing really truly for the first time that mental health is actually everybody's business. And so there's a newfound interest in this because everybody wants help in understanding, how do I look after myself? How do I look after other people? How do I respond to need in young people I wouldn't have expected to have needed this help before now? So I think as we think about our work going forward, we do have a new opportunity, and I think increasing the accessibility of the information we have about supporting everybody's well-being and taking a more active role in that, it is going to be really, really important, rather than it being seen as something that happens with a small group of people or is delivered by a small group of experts. So our mission as the Psychology in Schools team is to empower communities and to build capacity and resilience in those communities. And I think we're going to have even more of an opportunity to do that, not just as professionals, but also people who've experienced some of the things that those people that we'll be working with and those families we're working with have also experienced as well.
Wow, I like the fact that you started off with focusing on what you can do, especially in circumstances like this when it can be overwhelming, and it's giving you new opportunities to speak to people that you wouldn't have spoken to before. So that's really good to know. Thank you, Beth. Third question is this. So what are the challenges your team, the schools, the children, the parents will face in the new normal, whatever that looks like?
Well, I don't know about you, Andy. I mean, there are things that I am missing so much. And from day one, I'm missed so much. For example, I am the only adult in my household and I have 3 children. And so for me, one of the things that I was most upset about when lockdown came was the thought that I'm not going to physically see another adult potentially for however long. And I think the thought of going back into the world and having contact with other people and being able to connect again and do things like go down to the local pub garden and have a drink and meet up with family members and friends, you know, that's so exciting. But I also think that there have been certain things about the lockdown which I've quite enjoyed not having to do. For example, the school run in the morning and getting everybody up and out of bed and getting 3 different drop-offs and the dog dropped off somewhere and then getting to work and again the repeat when you get home. And I think the traveling during the working day is another thing. Going to meetings, I mean, we've learned about doing meetings virtually, which we just really didn't do before. We all traveled, all of us, to go and sit in a building around a big table, which had to be booked and paid for. And I think, you know, those are the kind of things that we are perhaps finding easier in our lives at the moment, because we're not having to juggle so many competing sensory and physical demands. So I think for me and for many people, the challenge is going to be, how am I going to cope with the pace of life and the sensory overload? I think that's one of the things I've come to recognize, is that my day was full of so much mixed sensory information, noise, traveling from here to there, being late for a meeting, just all of these different things. Now, I also struggle with being on my screen all day and not having enough sensory stimulation. So we were at one other extreme at the moment. So I think for lots of people, the demands that are going to come from people having to get back into normal life and back into that routine around getting up really early, getting everybody out, is going to feel a little bit daunting. And I think initially we're all going to feel quite tired. The days that I've gone out and done stuff in schools, I've come home and I felt literally exhausted, but also invigorated, because I've been able to see people, I've been in a different environment. So I think when we all think about September, particularly for schools and for families with children, going back and getting back into the old routine, we're going to need to give ourselves a period of grace, really, where our expectations around how efficient we might be or how knackered we're going to feel at the end of the day, we're going to need to reduce those. And that's something I learned at the beginning of this lockdown, is if I expect myself to be the perfect mom, the perfect school teacher, the perfect kind of team leader who can just be available all of the time and keep on top of my house and look after myself as well and make sure I'm doing enough exercise and eat all the right things, then actually I'm just going to, you know, not going to manage that, and I'm going to feel terrible about myself, and then I'm going to make everyone else feel terrible. And so quite quickly at the beginning of this, I recognized that if I didn't lower my expectations about what I should be able to achieve based on what I used to achieve, I was probably going to be feeling pretty low. And I think in some respects we need to be kind to ourselves as we go back into facing some of those challenges of adapting back into a new world, because we're not just going back to the old world, we're going to be juggling the pressures and thoughts and anxieties and worries about new ways of being near one another, new codes of conduct around PPE for some people. And so we're not just going back to the old world, we're going back to a familiar world, but with new rules, some of which we are going to agree with, some of which we might not agree with. And other people are also going to view these rules differently to us and are going to take things more seriously. And maybe for some people, it's less of a concern for them. They're going to be more laissez-faire about it. And how do we cope with that? How do we manage that? Especially if we've had significant events happen during this lockdown, significant losses. I think we're going to be quite sensitive, understandably so, to how other people are respectful about this and the way that they behave and manage it. So it's going to be a tough time, but I think what we've learned through this pandemic is the opportunities for kindness and compassion are 100% there and are massively well received by the people around us. So if we can hold that in mind, not just with the kindness and compassion we show ourselves, but also the way we respond to other people who might not behave as we would agree with, then I think that's a really important part of managing those difficulties.
So I what I've got from that is that be kind to yourself, and you can be kind to others and compassionate towards others. But as you have suggested, I see the future as being a mixture of how work and life has changed now and during the pandemic, and the future will be a mix of what was life like and work like before, and get the best of, if there are a few good things that have happened during the pandemic, and mix those into the future. That's probably the new normal. My last question, and you've partly sort of covered it, so you may have something else to add, which is, what learning do you think will come from this outbreak?
Well, I think this idea about a blended model of kind of relating to our work and other people, for particularly in the workplace, I think we've really had to be incredibly progressive and reactive and change quickly with the times, which normally change takes a significant amount of time and quite a lot of resistance. Whereas actually we've had no choice, and I think we've all learned how amazingly adaptable we can be. Certainly with kind of like the virtual platform, really. If someone had told me that I would be able to work from home full time without needing to leave my house and be effective in my job, I'd have just said, no way. If someone told me you're going to have to queue, to get into to do your weekly supermarket shop and stand behind a line and wash your trolley down, I'd have also said no way. But now that's becoming the norm. And so I think what we're learning about ourselves as human beings is that we're actually incredibly adaptable, and we're designed to cope with things that feel unsafe and respond in a way which enables us to still get on with life and live. And I think we find within that situation opportunities for creativity, for connecting with others. I know that other people have talked about this, but we've really, as a team, been able to work so much more closely with people that we would never have had that opportunity to work with before. And that's largely driven by the virtual platform, because a barrier is often geography. And we've been able to attend meetings that we'd have never had the time to attend before, because it would have taken us 90 minutes to get to that meeting. And I think there are other platforms, webinars, where people internationally around the world are actually meeting to generate new ideas and new ways of working. And it would have been something I just wouldn't have had the time or inclination to do so much of before. So I think embracing some of the opportunities here for connection, working in different ways, and some of the old practices which actually are not that helpful and just a part of old habits, we've got an opportunity to break away from those and do something different, something truly transformational. So I guess the learning is that we can adapt and we have opportunities for creativity. And let's not lose sight of that and return to the old habits, which might not be as progressive as we need to be as a society quite often. So I think I've spoken for quite a long time, so I probably shouldn't bang on anymore.
No, you weren't banging on at all. That was thank you. And it's a good note to end on. So thanks very much for your time.
Bye then.